very proud board chair of the Madison Square Park Conservancy. It's a pleasure to welcome you here today. Removing Public Art is the Conservancy's 4th annual symposium addressing critical issues in the public art field. Each year, we've invited esteemed artists, thinkers, and cultural leaders to discuss pressing matters that impact the public, the distinguished artists whose work we commission in Madison Square Park, and other like organizations around the country. We're pleased again to partner with the School of Visual Arts in this wonderful venue and to welcome our moderator, panelists, keynote participants, and artists for what I know will be another significant event. It's now my honor to introduce New York City Parks Department Commissioner Mitchell J. Silver, who oversees management, planning, and operations of nearly 30,000 acres of parkland. And that includes parks, playgrounds, beaches, marinas, recreation centers, and wilderness areas, all in New York City. Prior to returning to his native New York, he served as the Chief Planning and Development Officer and Planning Director for Raleigh, North Carolina. He was the Dunlop Lecturer in Housing and Urbanization at Harvard University, and in 2014 was inducted into the College of Fellows of the American Planning Association. When Commissioner Silver took the Parks job in 2014, he told the New York Times, "I believe in the anatomy of a place, of a city. Parks are a system within a city. They're connected to culture, they are connected to traditions and memories, the economy, the natural systems. As a planner, I take a very different view of parks as not just a green space, but a public space." Please join me in welcoming Commissioner Silver.
Thank you, Sheila, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Madison Square Park Conservancy Annual Symposium on Public Art, titled Removing Public Art. I want to thank our great partner, Madison Square Park Conservancy, led by Sheila Davidson and Keats Meyer, with whom we work closely. It's partnerships like this that help our agency care for parks across the city. I believe I saw him walking in, but the person who oversees our arts and antiquities, Jonathan Kuhn. I saw you in the room, Jonathan. Thank you also for coming, and he makes sure that our program runs wonderfully throughout the city. You are embarking on a day fashioned to explore how commemorating historical figures in permanence can be done in a way that is constructive and with cultural consideration for those monuments already in place and those to come. Mayor de Blasio has committed to creating a more equitable and inclusive New York City, and that commitment extends to expanding the histories that are represented on our city property. As a planner, I understand that cities are layers of history. And so we're always looking at our art and monuments with the lens of today's values, even though in the past they were put up or erected or symbolized the movement and values of that era. So that always represents a challenge, and I'm sure you'll hear that discussion today among our experts. As we continue to look for ways that new monuments can help build a more inclusive understanding of our city and its history. As many of you know, in a few years, we will install the newly commissioned Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony Women's Suffrage Movement Monument in Central Park. So you know, I lifted a 50-year moratorium on monuments in Central Park, and this will now be the first monument to real women in Central Park's history. Okay, I have to digress and tell you that story because I was approached by several individuals at some event in Central Park, and they say, "Commissioner, do you know there are no real women in Central Park?" And so I went to Jonathan and said, "Jonathan, is this true?" He said, "Yes, it's true." I said, "I can't believe it. Who has the power to change that?" And he says, "Oh, you do." So decision made. So in November of last year, the location was revealed and a call for artists was made by commissioning organization, its statue fund. Getting to that day took time and was plenty of passion, and it looks like a lot of discussion. The dialogue was not just about the two women, it was also about the movement at large and the diverse landscape of women who contributed to the movement and what could possibly look like in the movement from once interpreted by artists. Some 100 years after, these great women impacted the laws, on the books, and the American culture. Without thoughtful discussions like the ones that you will have today, Without broad public input and careful historical analysis, progress cannot be made. I thank you for being part of a larger discussion today, and as always, I thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Brooke Kamen Rappaport, the Madison Square's Art Deputy Director, and Martin Friedman, Senior Curator. Thank you and have a wonderful, provocative day.
Good morning, and thank you all for attending today. We are fortunate to have the generous support of the Henry Luce Foundation to realize this symposium. Thank you to Luce Program Director for American Art, Terry Carbone. And I also want to recognize the wonderful Keats Meyer, Madison Square Park Conservancy's Executive Director. And thank you to Julia Friedman, who has worked tirelessly on today's program with great expertise. In 2015, on the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War, artist Sonia Clark began a piece called Unraveling. The work in an edition of 10 is ongoing. Clark displays a Confederate flag, an aberrant 19th century symbol of the Confederate States of America that was maintained and revived into the 20th and 21st centuries. Clark purposefully selects a flag that's woven, as she describes, from thick, sturdy cotton and then stitched together so that it would have lasting power. Her performative project is to stand side by side with people and to together unravel that flag, to literally and metaphorically dismantle thread by thread generations of racism, slavery, segregation, and white supremacy. Unraveling is a remarkably human and human scale act, tugging at the fiber that bound some people together. Clark, who is here today, is sentient about the work she has to do. She has said, in an hour, we don't even get through half an inch of unraveling. It takes a long time. A flag is a potent public symbol. Its design, color scheme, location of display are all highly indicative of perspective and motivation. Does unraveling, removing, or extricating a flag have a different materiality or physicality than removing a public monument? We live in and breathe in perilous times where the national debate on removing monuments has placed public art at the epicenter, be it post-Civil War statuary created in the Jim Crow era, representations of obsolete heroes, or contemporary outdoor sculpture. Does the emptiness of a pedestal or a platform erase history or affirm a dismal shared history? Should museums or historical societies be charged with harboring or contextualizing offensive remnants of national history? And should it fall to artists to take on the responsibility to recontextualize historic sculpture? In June 2015, in the aftermath of the shooting at the Charleston, South Carolina, Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, where 9 African Americans were murdered, a number of American cities removed or began the dialogue to reconsider permanent public monuments and memorials dedicated to Confederate figures. New Orleans removed 4 of its most prominent monuments. In June 2016, a Confederate monument in St. Louis was dismantled and placed in storage. In Charlottesville, Virginia, in August 2017, a protest over the anticipated removal from Emancipation Park of an equestrian statue of Robert E. Lee erupted in violence, with white nationalists, neo-Nazis, and Ku Klux Klan members disrupting crowds. That monument was commissioned in 1917, the same year that America entered World War I. Why was a Civil War monument erected when America joined the Great War? These memorials coalesced decades later to codify and revitalize a white supremacist future. And what do the state of Georgia and the nation, how do they confront the colossal stone mountain, the country's largest Confederate monument carved in granite, initially by Gutzon Borglum, the sculptor of Mount Rushmore? Although begun as a Civil War monument in 1914 during World War I, Stone Mountain was dedicated in 1970, the same year as the Kent State shootings. Last summer, the United Daughters of the Confederacy in Kansas City asked the Parks Department there to remove and store a 1934 Loyal Women of the South monument. Here in New York, the Mayoral Commission on City Art, Monuments, and Markers issued a report in January of 2018 that developed policy recommendations and a framework on how this city cope with controversial historic monuments. As a result, the J. Marion Sims Monument, once installed on Fifth Avenue and 103rd Street, has been removed and relocated. Madison Square Park Conservancy and the 60,000 visitors who cross our site every day is suited to be part of this conversation because of the permanent monuments on our site and our program of temporary, contemporary commissioned public art. The most prominent and distinguished work in the park, dedicated in 1881, is to Union naval hero Admiral David Glasgow Farragut. But on Worth Square, just west of the park at Broadway and 25th Street, the Major General William Jenkins Worth Monument was installed in 1857. Worth has been called a distinguished general of the Mexican-American War. By 1843, his campaign with 4,800 troops, 3,824 Seminoles were cleared or killed in Florida as part of a federal campaign to send Native Americans from the south to west of the Mississippi. By 1843, Worth declared there were 300 remaining Indians living in South Florida. Native American genocide was recently the subject of artist Sam Durant's 2012 sculpture, Scaffold. In May 2017, the work was removed from the Minneapolis Sculpture Garden of the Walker Art Center because of protests by Native American leaders. I would like to begin the discussion today by recognizing the power, privilege, and primacy of works of permanent and temporary public art, how objects in our midst, historic or contemporary, despite the hold on our online lives, still hold sway and can still impact change, and we are seeing some change. In the form of a planned monument to civil rights leader and educator Mary McLeod Bethune in Washington's National Statuary Hall, and with artist Gillian Waring's sculpture of suffragist Millicent Fawcett in London's Parliament Square. So the question is, what is next for monuments, and what is the new monument? This morning, we have distinguished artists, cultural leaders, and thinkers, our moderator, New York Times art critic Jason Farago, and panelist Gonzalo Casals, executive director of the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art, and a member of the New York City Mayoral Advisory Commission on City Art, Monuments, and Markers, Kinshasa Conwill, Deputy Director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., artist Melvin Edwards, Siri Engberg, Senior Curator and Director of Exhibition Management at the Walker Art Center, Marnie Sandweiss, Professor of History and Director of the Princeton and Slavery Project at Princeton University. They will discuss the issues surrounding removing or retaining controversial public art. Artist Allison Sarr, whose project was on view in Madison Square Park in 2011, and whose significant 2007 bronze monument to abolitionist Harriet Tubman was commissioned by New York City, will participate in our keynote with Julian Zugazagoitia, director of the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. Artist Diana Al-Hadid, Arlene Sheckett, and architect Brian Lee will consider the monument in their work. We have an extraordinary group of participants today, and I am grateful to them for leading this conversation. It's a pleasure to welcome Jason Farago and the panelists. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see so many people here today for what I know will be a very engaging and in some ways difficult, but in many ways very important conversation. As the commissioner was saying, cities like New York are layered with history, and the conversation that we're going to have tonight is itself layered by history. The matter of removing public art, which is, by the way, not the same as destroying public art, and I think we'll probably discuss different kinds of removal and different methods of removal, is one that has roiled the curators like Brooke and programs like Madison Square Park for decades, and particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, visual artists have reckoned with both the placement and the displacement of art in the public sphere. So the matter of monuments and the matter of visual art that's in public run parallel, but they're not exactly the same. And then in 2015, with the unbelievably heinous murders in South Carolina, these matters came particularly to the fore with matters of commemoration of the Civil War, whether in the form of the flag or whether in the form of monuments. And then again in 2017, as we were saying, with what happened in Charlottesville. There's quite a bit of ground to cover, and so what we've asked the panelists to do is to give us a number of case studies. Each of them is going to go through for just 2 minutes and show a few slides of one or two examples of contested work that they've found worthy of discussion, and then I'm going to do my best to put them all in some kind of conversation to see if we can elicit some broader principles and some broader ideas about where we go from here. So Gonzalo is up first.
Thank you. Thank you, Brooke and Julia, for all the help in putting this together. This is amazing, and it's an honor to be with all of you here. I want to use my 2 minutes really efficiently. No?
Yep.
There you go. So I wanted to highlight the many conversations we have. The commission, we met, Harriet, I'm going to ask you to help me here. We met 4 times probably, and we have 5 public hearings. There were a lot of conversations, a lot of issues. Huh? Something like that. Harriet Seni was also on the commission with us. There were 2 issues that they were interesting to me. One, the idea of the additive approach. How do you grab an existing monument and you alter it, you add something and you alter it to change or complicate the narrative or make it a little more nuanced. And the other was the issue of what's the process of creating a monument? Who makes decisions? Who decides who deserves a monument? And I wanted to show the work of 2 artists that are sort of probably are going to help us to open up a little bit the possibilities of how we move forward with the idea of monumentalizing stories and people. The first one is Ken Gonzalez-Day. Ken Gonzalez-Day is a Chicano artist. He spent a lot of time researching lynching sites in California. During his research, he realized there was this practice of postcards depicting lynchings, real lynchings in the late 1900s, 20th century, that people could just tell to their friends and said, hi, you know, like, I hope everything's doing well. He started collecting these postcards, and then what he did it in a very simple gesture, remove the lynching body from the image. So as the spectators move our gaze from the victim to the perpetrators and to the accomplice. It's not only the gesture of the erasure, but it's also the idea of scaling. And I'm so glad that the screen is so big because usually he shows his work on a scale very similar to these for two reasons. One is this idea of monumentalizing a story, changing the narrative, and two is just to really bring the spectators to as close as they can be to the side. And you can start paying attention to the faces and the attitude of people watching that lynching. The other thing that was important to us when we show this at the museum is, yes, African Americans were the most common people being lynched, but Chicanos, queer people were also victims of this practice, and it was important for us to show that. It's taking
The top button, I think.
Huh?
The big one at the top.
That's what it is?
No?
No. There you go. The other artist I wanted to show is the work. This is a work that is in the collection of the museum, the work of Castles. Castles is a transgender artist. This is a really interesting work that speaks about voice, agency, process. The first work is called Becoming an Image, and is the artist in a dark room with a 2,000-pound block of clay, in which the artist starts punching and kicking and sort of like discharging all the anger into that piece of clay. There's people in the room. The room is pitch black. All you can hear is the sounds of the artist fighting this piece. And then at a set intervals, there's a flash photography that takes these pictures, and it just starts telling you what's happening. In many ways, with this work, the artist is trying to make attainable and visible the amount of the violence committed to the trans bodies and the trans communities. Once the performance is, this is really slow. Once the performance is over, the artist casted that block of clay in, that block of clay in bronze, just to, it's interesting to use bronze that sort of like is the traditional material for monuments as a way to, again, monumentalize that moment. That piece is called The Resilience of the 20%. In 2012, the amount of violence and committed to trans bodies has increased 20%, and it was important for the artist to mark this somehow. And then as a third life to this process, Monument Push is a performance in which the artist takes the monument to different cities in the country, and with the help of the trans community in that city, they push the monument to locations in which violence to the trans community has been performed. So in many ways, is this idea not only of monumentalizing, but also memorializing in an ephemeral way the voices of those that usually don't get monuments.
Great. If you would just pass the clicker down to Shasha.
And show her how to use
It's
it.
the right button, turns out.
And just give it a minute because...
Okay, I will assume that what I click will show, because you'll tell me.
Yep,
'cause
keep going. One more.
It's killing me to turn back.
One more.
One more. You got it.
Bueno. Does it say where you stand depends on where you sit?
No, go one more. That's just finished.
Well then.
Yeah.
Oy.
There you go.
Gracias, gracias. Okay, so as I said, where you stand depends on where you sit. I'm going to speak very quickly about two very different public objects. One is Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, which was in Federal Plaza here in New York City from 81 to 89, a commission originally approved by the National Endowment for the Arts. Remember, individual artist grants. They're not resting in peace, but they're resting. So it was up for quite a long time, but there was an outcry from the beginning about it. it, as well as great support. The cartoon, beautiful cartoon, is of Bree Newsome, the great young activist and artist and musician who removed the Confederate flag from Columbus, South Carolina, with her partner in protest, James Tyson.
Push a little harder.
Pardon?
A little harder. Yeah, you got it. There's Sarah.
Okay. And so, Richard Serra. This is my confessional that I said to Brooke Kamen Rappaport, and I adore her, so let's just be real. That's why I'm here. That was so exciting. I forgot what I wanted to say. No, what I admitted when I talked to Gonzalo and Brooke and others was that when Richard Serra's piece was removed, I was outraged. I thought, this is an artist of enormous talent. This was a site-specific work, and as the artist said, if you remove this work, you remove the whole context of the art. That does not have meaning elsewhere, as the British say. You see the speak out, which is the public, come and speak out against this. We want to hear you, all voices will be heard. And that gash that you see is the site where it was indeed removed. Oops, am I doing?
There's the gash.
Yeah,
Okay, different slide?
you were.
Did I go to the
You
hell?
were showing that.
Oh,
one.
I was showing that. Sorry. Okay, I was showing it
And now
being
yeah.
installed. Let me go back to that.
You're on installation right now. And then
Pardon?
You're here.
Installation. Thank you so much. The eyes in my back of my head aren't working today because I wanted you to see what it looked like. It was quite beautiful, according to those of us who liked it. According to others, it was an abhorrent gash, and they couldn't see.
And now you're in that one.
Oh, now I'm that one? Okay. Gonzalo, what would I do without you, love? All right. So next, I'm going to move to, I hope.
Yeah.
Did I go? Am I?
You're
Okay.
there.
So the great Bree Newsome and James Tyson. And this is an interesting thing because for those of you who either were born or lived in the South or know about it, these images are particularly potent because to this day, I mean, I didn't look back when Stone Mountain was mentioned. I grew up in Georgia. I cannot even stand the fact that there is a Stone Mountain. I never went to Stone Mountain. I will never go to Stone Mountain. Confederate flags make me feel physically unwell, and pictures of lynching are so disturbing to me that even though we have them in our museum, I can barely look at them. So these potent images are such that their removal for some becomes an act of faith, an act of common cause with people who think that hateful images have no place. And Robert E. Lee, one of the heroes of the Confederacy, or the Lost Cause as its adherents think of it, was not only, if you read Adam Serwer's excellent piece in The Atlantic, was not only a terrible strategist, he was barely a tactician, he was a cruel owner of human beings, and he was a cruel general. And he meted out special cruel punishment against African Americans who were captured. So not a good soldier, not a good human being. So these brilliant young people decided, is there one more slide?
No, I think that's your last one.
That's one, thank you. What would I do without these folks? Come with me to every panel, will you? But what's so great about this is that this was common cause. The two of them decided that they would do this together, and Mr. Tyson decided that he would make sure that he took a secondary position to Bree Newsome because he thought it was time for white folks to make common cause, but to not be so much part of the issue. And you'll hear later, if we get a chance to, about how he literally risked his life, as she did, because there was a point at which they were going to try to get them down, and what the action they were going to take might have electrocuted both of them. But they lived to go to jail and to be freed, and we have a great example of, I guess you probably figured out where I stand and where I sit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next is Melvin.
First of all, since it's about art, I'd say welcome. It's nice to talk to people about art because it's a way of life I've chosen to live for 81 years. Well, the first part, but the part that had to do with my decision was to be involved in making art, that is, to expressing ideas that I have had and have encountered during those years. This particular topic, public art, the recent interest in it is interesting to me because society does shake up itself every now and then. I started making large-scale sculpture in 1969-70. I'm going to turn my back to the audience so I can see what comes on the screen. So just so you know, I'm not trying to be impolite. I can do that, but that's not what I'm doing. So I was in an automobile accident about a month and a half ago, so I try to actually be comfortable. No, I can handle the chair. It's not that. You know, but then I'll see what. Okay. It could be considered conceptual public statement, but it's not. See, my take on conceptual art is that there's no art that doesn't have a conceptual aspect. So, but since we've emphasized it in the language of the art world lately as a separate issue, but it really can't be. It's like having a baby. No conceiving, no baby. This is the second large sculpture that I made. It's in Columbus, Ohio. 1982 is its date. Its title, Out of the Struggles of the Past to a Brilliant Future, is not mine, but it was the title of the community when they decided that they wanted to renovate Mount Vernon Plaza section of Columbus, Ohio, which is, you could say, the Harlem of Columbus. And so this was what I came up with as that idea. It's about, the stainless steel part is 18 feet high. It's about 30 feet across. If there's any metaphorical content in relation to the title, the open spaces are what the future can be. In other words, the future is what we might make of it, or what the people might make of it. We jumped. This is a sculpture at, as you see, Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania. It's dedicated to a man named David McDonald, who, as far as we know, he's the only person, while legally still a slave, got a college degree. And that was in around 1844, 45, somewhere in there. His owner of the McDonald family, which had presence in Baltimore, Maryland, and New Orleans and Mississippi. And in Mississippi, there was a plantation of more than 500 slaves. McDonald, the owner, decided that blacks and whites were not going to be able to live together cooperatively when slavery ended, and he could see that that was coming. So he was a part of a movement to have slaves go back to Africa. As a part of that, he was allowing his slaves to work an extra day and earn their passage to Africa, if you will. He still kept them working. In other words, as a part of his idea of the end of slavery, Africans could go back but take American civilization, religion with them. David McDonald, who he put into college at Lafayette College, decided part of the way through his education that he didn't want to go to Africa, but that he wanted to become a doctor. He graduated and then got a doctor, a physician in New York, related to, I guess, what is now the College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York, to train him to be a doctor. So from roughly 1849 to when he died in 1889, he had an office in the part of New York that's called New Africa, not far from where we're sitting now, because it was in the West 130s, the West 30s in New York. Later on, it was known as Hell's Kitchen, but it was New Africa in that period. McDonough was so respected as a doctor that they built a hospital in his honor in about 1880, and it was the first hospital in New York to accept patients and physicians regardless of race. So these issues are not just limited to the South, not just limited to the recent interest in race as it is in our time, but it's perennial in American and in Western society. It's a perennial problem, and it's manifest in many ways related to life. For instance, if there was a program in American government to have children supported at the preschool level, in other words, Operation Head Start, and then the politicians eliminated it, and then we see that many young adult Afro-Americans are in prison, and then prison is used as an industry very similar to slavery. Or if you take terms like the minimum wage, what did slaves earn? They earned the minimum wage. This piece is called Passage. It's at Kingsborough Community College out near the airport in Queens. And it's been there 30 years. This photograph was taken last month when they decided to celebrate the fact that this piece had been there 30 years and is often the site of graduation ceremonies at the college. This is also in the Long Island area. This is called Confirmation. It's at the federal building, which houses the Social Security organization for the government. The reason for the title Confirmation is twofold. As they presented the idea, I realized that Social Security is the only law or act of our government that gives everybody, no matter who they are, who's lived and worked in this society, something for that. In other words, since the Constitution, Bill of Rights and stuff, in relation to actually giving us something for, which ultimately is not a gift, but a part of, like getting older in your own family. The other reason for the title is a great musical composition by Charles Christopher Parker, or Charlie Parker, and it's called Confirmation.
Melvin, if I could maybe ask to discuss a little when we get into the discussion, because I was hoping to bring in the other two panelists as well. Would that be all right?
You mean I'm not the only one?
I promise we're going to come back to it. Thank you so much.
No, you're welcome. I guess in that case,
This photo's amazing.
better turn
We'll come back to it, I
around.
promise.
Excuse me for taking time, but in the family, I am a run-on sentence.
I'll take that. Thank
There
you.
you go.
Okay. There we go. So I'm talking about the Minneapolis Sculpture Garden, and as Brooke mentioned earlier, the removal of a sculpture by the artist Sam Durant. The Minneapolis Sculpture Garden, which we're looking at here, is this summer marking its 30th anniversary. Opened in 1988, the garden was the first public-private urban sculpture park of its kind, a vision of then Walker director, the late Martin Friedman, and the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board.
Anchored by Klaus Oldenburg and Kosha van Bruggen's iconic Spoon Bridge and Cherry, which you see in the background. Sorry, trying to get to the next slide. There we go. The garden's welcomed more than 10 million visitors since it first opened and now showcases some 60 works from our collection. A model for urban sculpture parks nationwide, the garden is a destination for tourists, for schools, and for attendees at special events programmed by the Walker. In 2014, the garden was showing its quarter century of wear, and bonding was finally secured for a reconstruction. A more sustainable, art-friendly landscape was designed, and we secured 17 new works, a new generation of artists for the garden, through purchases, gifts, and commissions. One of these was Scaffold. Oh, here are the new works. Sorry, this clicker is slow. I'm trying to catch up here. There we go. One of these works was Scaffold, a monumental work by Los Angeles artist Sam Durant. Scaffold is a complicated work of public art, conceived by the artist as a commentary and critique about the ongoing use of capital punishment in the U.S. Formally, the sculpture is a composite, overlaying and interweaving the architectures of 7 different gallows used in U.S. state-sanctioned executions across American history, ranging from that of abolitionist John Brown in 1859 to that of Saddam Hussein in 2006. The perimeter of the structure, perhaps its most visible element, is a representation of the gallows used in the execution of 38 Dakota men in Mankato, Minnesota in 1862, the largest mass execution in U.S. history. The work premiered to an international audience at Documenta 13 in Kassel, Germany in 2012, where it was seen by the Walker's director and a curator, and acquired soon after for a future installation in our garden. The work then went on to be exhibited in Scotland and at The Hague, and was put in storage to await its shipment to Minnesota. Through 2016, our staff worked steadily toward the campus reopening, citing new commissions and beginning to develop interpretation, wayfinding, and visitor amenities. As spring neared, the wood for Scaffold came out of storage and began to be erected on its metal frame. We began finalizing interpretive texts about the piece. It was then, however, that the Walker came to realize a major institutional blind spot. Sam Durant's sculpture was now taking form within a new context. Minnesota has one of the largest Native populations in the country and the largest Dakota population. The Minneapolis Sculpture Garden, located on the Mississippi watershed, is original Dakota land. Mankato, Minnesota, on the site of the Dakota 38 hangings, and Fort Snelling, the site of a Dakota concentration camp and hanging of 2 Dakota men, are both less than 1 hour from the Minneapolis Sculpture Garden. This was not Documenta, this was not The Hague, this was Minneapolis. We were too late in acknowledging this history. We had failed to reach out to community at the right moment. The piece was being erected in the garden, and we should have been in conversation long before its acquisition. With construction fences still up, the Walker engaged discussions with members of the Native arts community. The response was direct and unwavering. If you don't remove it, you will have immediate and long-lasting trouble, offered one respected Native arts professional. Director Ogleviso acknowledged in an open letter that the Walker's process of placing the sculpture had been flawed, as the museum did not seek early dialogue with Native communities before the work was acquired or installed. She extended a sincere apology to the Dakota for the Walker's failure to consider the work's implications in a Minnesota context and the trauma that it would elicit. The response was immediate to the letter. Social media ignited, and protesters gathered within an hour at the construction fence. A week before the garden's scheduled reopening, our staff prepared for crisis. As protests heightened to threats of violence, the Walker contacted members of the Dakota elder community to de-escalate the situation and to work together toward a mediated solution. The decision was made to delay the reopening of the sculpture garden by 1 week in order to allow time for the mediation. Sam Durant offered to participate and immediately flew to Minneapolis. As seen here on the lower right, on May 31st, 2017, in a facilitated media process that respected all parties, Sam Durant, representatives from the Dakota community, Walker staff, and leaders of the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board resolved to remove Scaffold. What had been intended by the artist as a productive platform for dialogue had become, in the Minnesota context, a site for a reminder of historical trauma. And in Sam Durant's view, this meant the piece could not function as he intended it to. The artist, who has made many works that tackle social, political, and cultural issues, often directly engaging histories of protest, took it a step further. He made the decision to relinquish the work's intellectual property to the Dakota so they might claim this potent symbol of the past. As he put it, I chose to do what I did freely. For me, the work no longer fulfilled my intentions. Scaffold was dismantled by a Dakota-led construction crew during a ceremony on June 2nd, 2017, led by Dakota spiritual leaders and elders. The Dakota people took possession of the wood, choosing to bury it in an undisclosed location. And here we are, exactly a year later. In the days and months since Scaffold was removed, the Walker has owned, as a staff and board, a moment of institutional humility and admission, and has vowed to work differently. There's been some good progress. We've restructured a more effective discussion-focused acquisitions process. We've established clear accountability between curatorial and education for artwork interpretation, and we're developing new protocol for placing artwork in public space. We're also focused on programmatic change, adding new public programs and online publishing. And in addition, a selection committee comprised of Minnesota and national Native artists, art professionals, and knowledge keepers is currently working with Walker curators to commission a new work by an Indigenous artist for the Walker campus. We've learned that normal after a crisis feels radically different than normal before the crisis happened. Crises change people and organizations. In our case, the experience began important learnings for the future. There are now more questions in front of us. When we consider commissioning and placement of public art, are we asking the right questions? Who are the communities? Who are the stakeholders? And what is the context? Where are our blind spots, individually and institutionally? How can we more meaningfully create the composition of our board and staff to better reflect the diversity of our community? And lastly, how can we continue to be, as has long been our mantra, a safe space for unsafe ideas? A space that asks questions about the world in which we live and also supports artists and audiences. But as Sam Durant asks, to do this in a way that is generous and civil. Thank you.
Thank you, Siri.
Good morning. I'm here today in two capacities. First, as a professor of history at Princeton, who's led the current Princeton and Slavery Project, and secondly, as a scholar whose work has focused on the American West. As I see it, the key challenge on our historic campus, to which the college moved in 1755, is not what's there, but what's not there. Yes, our campus is filled with portraits and sculpted likenesses of dead white men, including our first 9 presidents, slaveholders all. And the presidents' portraits hang in our historic faculty room that you see here, which is where the Continental Congress met in 1783. And as such, they perfectly represent the paradox that's at the heart of American history. Liberty and slavery were ever intertwined. Our president, John Witherspoon, a slaveholder, was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Do I think we should hide the central paradox of American life? No. Leave the portraits, leave the sculptures, I say. They fairly and truly represent what Princeton was. And they reveal the foundation that America was built on. I see no reason to deny that. But I do think we need to add to this memorial landscape. These images, these sculptures represent what Princeton was, but they do not represent what Princeton is. And we're now trying to expand our memorial landscape in 3 ways. First, by adding to our campus portrait collection in public spaces, a more diverse group of figures who have made distinguished contributions to campus life. Second, by naming public sites on our campus, most recently a garden and an archway, after 2 enslaved people who worked on our campus, gained their freedom, and made important contributions to community life. And finally, by inviting artists to make their own interventions, representing our past in new and more provocative ways. This past winter, we worked with the Princeton University Art Museum to commission the artist Titus Kaphar to make this piece that sat for about 6 or 8 weeks in front of the historic President's House on our campus, where enslaved people lived until at least 1822. What you see here is a silhouette of President Samuel Finley, whose slaves were auctioned on the site on our campus in 1766. There's a silhouette of Finley's head, and then imagined images of his enslaved workers etched across his face. At night, the image, which was internally lit, came alive, and Finley's face and features emerged out of the darkness to compete with the images that you see of the enslaved people. All things considered, I think the memorial landscapes of campuses are not all that hard to change, especially on private campuses like ours. The history can be known, the spaces are finite, and the key groups of stakeholders, the students, the alumni, the staff, are easily identified. But certainly other places are more complicated. So let me put on my other hat for a moment and speak about the American West, because as Siri just suggested, the current monument debates are not confined to debates about slavery or the Confederacy. When in 1991, a group of northern New Mexico Hispanic organizations finally raised the funds to build a statue to Don Juan Oñate, one of the Spanish conquistadors who helped Spain seize control of this part of the continent, it seemed a triumph, a way of challenging the growing Anglo political influence in this part of the state and proclaiming this as their historic turf. It was a mark of Hispano pride. But Oñate, a hero to the Spanish colonists of New Mexico and their descendants, had a different reputation among the Pueblo peoples that he subdued. In 1599, he led an attack on Acoma Pueblo, killing some 800 to 1,000 people. Later, he sentenced the male survivors to have a foot cut off. That memory is not lost to Native peoples. In 1998, the right foot was cut off a statue of the conquistador that stands in Alcalde, New Mexico. And so it is hard to conceive how the city fathers went ahead with their plans to erect another large equestrian statue of Oñate at the El Paso, Texas airport in 2006. The missing foot was revealed about a year or two ago, although its owner has kept his identity a secret. These particular tensions run deep in New Mexico, where activists have chiseled the word savage out of the monument at the heart of the plaza in Santa Fe, the old capital of Spanish New Mexico. And I predict these tensions are not over, because the lines between victors and losers, between perpetrators and victims, these lines are not so easily drawn when one takes a long historical perspective. One of the figures representing New Mexico in the National Hall of Statuary in the Capitol in Washington, D.C. is Pope, a Tewa-speaking man from Okeawinge Pueblo, who led the most successful Indian uprising in American history, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which drove the Spanish from New Mexico for 12 years. He and his followers destroyed Catholic churches. They murdered Spanish priests. And I have no idea what the congressional leaders were doing on the day they approved the installation of this statue. But if Pope and Oñate could go head-to-head, I'm actually not sure who would win. But I think the imagined juxtaposition between these two works of public statuary vividly illustrate the complexities of honoring figures from the past in a way that allows everyone's historical memory and sense of injustice to be acknowledged and to be felt. Historians say it so often, I know it's become a cliche, but it's true. History is complicated.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of our panelists. As you can tell, the issues that we're debating are so heartfelt and so complicated that it's difficult to get a hold of all of them, and certainly quite difficult to discuss them in limited amounts of time. And so what I'm going to try to do is synthesize a little bit. I sort of see two axes that could maybe help us think about all of these things together. One is the distance between memorials or monuments that are principally understood as memorials or monuments to the person depicted rather than as works of art. In many cases, the statuary of Confederate soldiers was, ordered from catalogs or from foundries that did almost mass distribution in the late 20th century, versus, on the other hand, works in public space that we principally understand as artworks, whether those are wholly abstract in the case of Richard Serra, or in Melvin's case, can have great artistic autonomy, but still be in commemoration of an individual or a population, and understanding the sort of different issues that are raised by these distinctions. And then on the other axis is the question of removal done by individuals in the case of Brynildsen, done by private organizations in the case of Princeton University, or done by bureaucratic means in the case of the Marion Sims, precisely. So maybe we could start with the sort of art versus monument, art versus memorial question, because it sort of hits on a number of your presentations. To what degree can we easily cleave this distinction? Are there works in the public space that are simply not worth thinking about aesthetically at all because their principal function is commemoration, in many cases commemoration of hatred? Or are we always talking about something visual, always talking about something artistic? I can call on one of you unless one of you wants to jump at it.
So Jason, is the question, so the Robert E. Lee statues that are too prevalent, is the question you're asking whether or not these are works of art?
Whether or not they're worth reckoning with as works of art, yes.
To me, the issue is, are they worth reckoning with, period? And I think part of what this discussion uncovers is the distance between what I like to call the so-called art world and the rest of the world. I was wondering when that would happen. I knew that it would happen, that pen would drop. And my friend, once again, so I think of so many of these discussions in the public sphere about art and about rights and about community. And there's a painting that was done by a young woman, Dana Schutz, that
At the Whitney
that represents Emmett Till. At the National Museum of African American History and Culture, we have the casket of Emmett Till. And so many people want to know, what did Lonnie Bunch, our director, think? What did I think? What other people think? But one of the things I thought is that the shoulders of Ms. Schutz, the shoulders of even Durant, who's made this very generous gesture, are rather slim for these discussions. These are discussions which are enormously important, and they speak to many things: ruptures in society, horrors and enslavement and hatred, but they also speak to the distance between those institutions and those makers and the rest of the public. And they speak to the vast lack of education and knowledge in our country. And to me, the most hopeful part of the question is, how teachable are these moments? What can people learn from the painting, the sculpture? And just one tiny thing, Jason, and all about the many things that Brooke mentioned. If you notice the timing, these were not memorials, these Confederate memorials, put up right at the end of the Civil War.
Right.
They came up later, and as Lonnie Bunch and others have talked about, they came up in particular times that coincided with major moments of oppression.
Of early 20th century,
yes,
the Jim
exactly.
Crow era, and then around the Civil Rights Movement as
and
well.
that was not a mistake.
Right.
But also, I think what's at the core of the issues that we're talking about is not necessarily if this work is art or it's just a mail order, monument, is that is in the public, right? And it's the impact that has to whoever is around it. And to me, what's really interesting of the four monuments that we were discussing, I had a personal connection with the Marion Sims because I worked at El Museo del Barrio for 8 years. There was a group of women, Puerto Rican and African American women, fighting for a decade for that monument to be removed. And this was sort of the entry point in which they were able to make that happen, right? So we can talk about history, and I completely respect what you're saying, but when the trauma of a community it's put, behind, a history lesson, I'm starting asking questions, is that important or not? And meaning goes beyond aesthetics, I think.
And yet, at the moment of tilted arc, many of us on this panel, I'm sure, would have been saying to people who disapproved of tilted arc, which is obviously quite a different question, that even if you disapproved in aesthetic terms, the artist had a not necessarily absolute, but had a certain autonomy that went beyond matters of judgment. And I would love to ask you, Siri, about this a little bit as well. Is there any ability to find a clear dividing line before which an artist has the freedom, the autonomy to reckon with difficult issues, and beyond which it's no longer his or her story individually, but is opened up onto a greater number of stakeholders?
I think what we learned, what Sam learned about this particular piece, is that context is absolutely everything. I mean, and the difficult thing about Scaffold in particular was that it was a piece that had been made and shown several times before, and then sort of put away, and and then it came back in this new context, and suddenly everything was completely.
That was true of Dana Schutz's painting as well.
Completely different.
Right.
So I think that consideration, that acknowledgement of context at the early point that it needs to happen is for an artist and for an institution working with that artist is very, very crucial.
Can I say one thing was about context? With Melvin Edwards' work and with work of folks like Richard Hunt, Allison Sarr, Faith Ringgold, there's a lot of work particularly in communities of color that aren't removed, but they are removed in a different way because they are not entered as much as they should be into the dialogue about what art is. And so there are these huge controversies about works by white artists that do this, that, or the other. But these, if you follow Melvin's work, you'll know about lynching from his Lynch Fragment series. You'll know about Leon Damas. You'll know about others. You'll know about Harriet Tubman if you follow Allison's work. So I think there's another kind of conversation about monuments, meaning, and context that we need to have, kind of as you talked about, Professor, what is missing. So it's not only do we remove these white men who owned human beings, but do we raise up the stories of others? So do we raise up the stories of those artists who are in communities around the country and around the world? In the case of this young man next to me, he's quite young, 81. He's a kid. So I think that's another kind of context that's worthy.
Thank you, Kinshasa, for the
I've
happy
never
birthday.
met you before.
I know
I
that.
heard a lot about you.
You sing happy birthday very well. Okay. But the second piece shown, I think it was, at Mount Vernon Plaza in Columbus, Ohio. It's an interesting incident that I think says a little bit about public and art. We were just finishing the installation of the piece, and I was working with a grinder. And Mount Vernon Plaza is a community developed with a 13-story building for senior citizens, two-story level housing for families with young children and that sort of thing. And then some community projects, that is, I think a junior college and a bank and things like that. But anyway, at a moment in the finishing, a lady and her son were coming by, and the lady stopped me and she said, "Tell me, whose monstrosity is this?" And I'm not too slow. I said, "Oh, this is mine." She said, "Oh, it's very nice." So what you've got to understand is there's a life that goes on in relation to the work that's not in our conversations. Another incident similar, Nelson Mandela was being paraded in New York, and I guess there were 100,000 people there, you know. And, you know, I was just another person in the audience. And all of a sudden, somebody said, "Hey, sculptor! Hey, sculptor!" Well, Nelson Mandela's not a sculptor, you know. And I knew I was, but, you know, why would in this crowd somebody be? Anyway, I turned around, and a man from a housing project called Lafayette Gardens in Jersey City said, "Hey, sculptor, do you remember me? I was a part of the celebration for your piece." Well, that had been several years before. And then he went on to explain, he said, "You know, now people who graduate from high school or college come there and they have their pictures taken. People who get married in the community have their wedding pictures taken there. Those are things that you don't anticipate in relation to your work. At least I hadn't when initially starting to get the opportunity to make public works. But the issue we're talking about, to remove or not, that's very old. We're talking about something, this is a petty part of history. The pharaohs were cutting down the monuments that other pharaohs had made before because they wanted to express, yeah. And of course it was before that time. These are perennial historic realities and issues, not because it's art, but because it's public art. And public means everybody, and everybody has an opinion or can have. And everybody can do something about it. That is, in the sense of, well, if there are all these negative monuments made related to American history, there are plenty of sculptors who are ready to do the other ones, and from many different directions, you know. If there's a big one of Robert E. Lee, okay, then I'll put up a big one next to it, you know, or in the vicinity.
Who will it be?
Or say, it'll be me, self-portrait.
But yeah,
No,
this matter.
but what I'm getting at is these things have been dealt with, actually, by the public in many ways. Some as obvious as defacing them or cutting off the foot or things like that. But other ways have been just as ignored, and the pigeons don't care what it says, you know.
That's
So,
correct.
okay, anyway.
I just want to get to, were you going to jump in? Or?
Well, I was just going to say that one of the reasons I wanted to bring up the Oñate statue is that I think it's actually reasonably easy to come to agreement that Confederate statues represent something nefarious. We get that.
Not in Richmond.
Well,
I know
true.
what you mean.
No, because what we're really dealing about is something we call public memory, like how people now have their own stories that attach to these objects from the past. But I think it's very difficult to come up with principles for the kind of adjudication or kind of conversations you were having at the Walker. Because Hispanic people and Indian people, both in the Southwest, now feel that they are minority groups who are being oppressed by the growing Anglo majority of the region. How do you adjudicate one person's sense of grievance with another person's sense of grievance? And I think when we move actually out of the Confederate and slavery debates, that helps us see that this is extremely complicated. And I don't know how we move towards principles as opposed to quick historical
I'm really
judgments.
glad you.
But I'm sorry, maybe it's because of where I work. I think, and being in D.C. is so different from being in New York, where I lived for many years with my late husband, Houston. The Confederacy is alive and well in the halls of Congress, on the lips of everyone. It is alive and well in places just outside of D.C. And so you don't even have to go as far south as Richmond. So I think that if it doesn't, and if you're lucky enough for it to not be as vibrant reality, air quotes, as it is in that area, please know that it is extraordinarily potent, vibrant, and no matter what, I mean, it's what Faulkner said, the past is not dead, it is not even past. It is not. It is in some ways, Professor, more alive, absolutely, than any discussion about art and any discussion about anything. And that's what's one of the things that's what's so grievous, but also nagging. You can't figure out, you can come up with principles for artists, and you can, and I will say, I think one of the things that's changed in this is the fact that you are at Princeton is different from if everybody at Princeton was still a white man. I think that's made a big difference. Who's at the table? But when you're talking to someone who fervently believes, who has no vested, they're not even a daughter of the Confederacy, in it being alive and well, it is. I wish it weren't, but it is very vivid. Which is Charlottesville. I mean, Charlottesville revived all of the canards of not only the Confederacy, but also of Nazism.
Well, if I could just say, Charlottesville also was what triggered the commission that you sat on, Gonzalo, which was the one that led to the Marion Sims statue being removed, and also had the question of principles at its heart. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, but also just to add one more thing to what you were saying, you said history is complex, right? But what was extremely telling is also how myths are created around, people and monuments.
Sure.
And it was amazing to see how many people came out to defend Columbus' statue, right? And Columbus became a way for the Italian Americans, like at that moment were a minority, as you were mentioning, Latinos and Native Americans, just to access privilege, right? So it's not only history, but it's that. But speaking of the principles, reckoning with history, and that history is our past is complex. The idea that many stories, which is something I personally have a lot of issues. There's only one history, I think. The problem is that history is written by the victors, right? And that we're talking about monuments as monuments are a symptom of how we look at history. And until we don't start dealing with that, I don't think we're going to find an easy way out how to deal with these monuments.
Which the commission did not, of course, right?
No.
Yeah.
It's like 90 days and 5 meetings and yeah. But this idea of also, there was a lot of interest of being like forward looking and just rather than spend a lot of political efforts, just bringing things down, what is missing and what can we do to add to that.
Yeah.
And I think one of the best things that came out of that is a mapping project for Native American history in New York that's going to sort of, again, write the history that probably is not as visible. And out of that, probably, not even monuments, because also monuments is a very European, Eurocentric way of honoring something, right? So.
We're going to open this up to just a few questions. There are staffers who have microphones who will be in the aisles. Given the fact that we're running a little long on time, the more precise your question, the more productive it will be for everyone. The woman in the back there would be the first.
So I'm curious, as we're talking about the evolution of monuments and the evolution of memorializing people and events, is the figurative or is a memorial that specifically depends on the likeness and a kind of staid and steadfast mythology still working? And what are the new forms of memorialization where it can evolve and it can change and it can live? Is there a new typology that we need to approach in order to have this conversation of history? Because the issue with, I guess, just leaving up these figurative memorials is that we often don't edit them to reflect our new understanding of how history and society is viewing these events and how mythology has evolved and is continuously broken.
It's an excellent question. You want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question because there's an inherent tension, right? History changes all the time. History changes every day because new people are writing it and they're asking different questions and they're drawing their ideas from different places. But the figurative monument is fixed. It's cast in bronze, right? It doesn't change. And so I think that's a truly important question. But I think if I can guess perhaps what's behind that, I do think that more abstract or conceptual forms of art will also be time bound, and they will also be difficult for people in the future to place their new interpretations on. Art is time bound, and our thinking about history is not, and I don't know a good way to resolve that.
And I don't know that it has to be resolved. I mean, I think that in our own time, we each live with something in art. I mean, there's an artwork that I saw about 40 years ago almost at the LA County Museum of Art by an artist whose last name is Smith, Alexis Smith, but it was I think it was about Scheherazade, but whatever it was amazing. Mendy and Keith Obadike are two sound artists, African American, who do these wonderful pieces. They have this piece, Compass Song, which has been done here and around the country. They will not live the way the statue of all those guys in Central Park and wherever might live, or the famous, statues like natural history museums around the world, where there's always the guy on the horse and the Native American or the African, on their knees. But they live somewhere else, and I think part of maybe this new notion is, how do we help, and particularly those in institutions, how do we help those live? And because in a way, what happens in Central Park, many people walk by those statues all the time, have no idea who the people are. If you don't have a square named after you, it's kind of hard to know, what is that a statue of? Like, everybody here who knows all the statues in Central Park by the name, who they are and where they are. Raise your hands. And no commissioners, and people at the Parks Department allowed. But but I do hope that, to our questioner's point, we can begin to animate more. And I mean, I'd love to see, I don't want much, I would love to see a map of all of Mel's work and Allison's and everyone else's, all the public art everywhere, so that people, wherever they go, can go see contemporary artists' work. I mean, this is a city that is rich with work. It's one of the best cities to see public art, but even with the great programs, I don't think people know where that's located. So how do we animate it? How do we make that live?
Right? We have another question there in the back.
Thank you so much for such enlightening conversation. I'd like to ask about perhaps what might sound like a conservative way to go, but maybe deeply, deeply most human, and that is that from the Judaic standpoint, despite misunderstandings about our relationship to visual culture and our love of art, there is a sense that the Second Commandment truly forbid any representation of any human being. Does policy formation in the freest of societies need to be informed by that return to the erasure of all faces and human forms? And then in the arts community, progress made towards a truly conceptual approach to all and every one, to all matters of history and everyone who is a player within it. Mm-hmm. And what's the art community's responsibility for helping educate folks in interpreting those conceptual pieces?
It's a good question, especially considering that after World War II and after the Holocaust, the challenge of representation, the impossibility of representation, was one of the principal drivers of a lot of conceptual projects of the post-war. And the Vietnam Wall would be another example. Does somebody want to tackle that?
Yeah, I think it's really a simple answer. It's all out there in all forms. One commandment from one particular source. There's already other opinions existing. You couldn't have that commandment if you didn't already have many ways of approaching producing imagery. So artists or human beings produce all kinds of imagery. In other words, we speak the European group of languages and the writing that is. But there are the Asian systems of writing, which we don't understand or know. They all exist. They're all valid. Everybody in this room has a different voice, and every voice is valid because nature makes it so, and we can communicate through all those differences. So I don't find the reality of differences in the way artists may work. I took a couple of teenage visitors a month ago to the Martin Luther King monument in Washington, and in the discussion, it wasn't important to me that the monument was figurative, but I know that for many people it had to look like Martin, you know, and that was important from that point of view. The important thing for me was that the issues, that the significance of Martin's life and the many lives that really make up the movement that was changing the society, that's just one man, one face, one preacher, you know, with a few words. As profound as he was individually, we have many people that profound from our community and all the communities in the society. We're really talking about how do you construct and reconstruct and continue to reconstruct and evolve a society. That's the base for all art. That's the base for all music. I used to teach a course that I invented called Third World Art. Somebody asked me, what is that? And I said, well, that's really all the art in the world. Because, you know, that's just a fact. But yes, I'm teaching in the United States, in a world that I grew up in, which has its ways of being. I was born in the South. I know segregation, absolutely, you know. But I did spend 5 years in the North, and I saw the North's contradictions, you know, with its freedom and its integration. And those things are still playing back and forth, whether it's in visual art. Cinema is the art, and now cinema's evolved to all the cyber processes, you know. All of them are art that we take our ideas from, and at the same time, we still hold on to the need for what we put in museums and in public parks and stuff like that. It's all a part of the package. No one set of images or ways of making images is an answer. It's simply a part of the discussion, and that's what I am, or we are.
If we could only get that into the guidelines for public art, that every public art doesn't have to be a representation of a physical person. And as what Brandy Chastain can tell you, it may not end up looking like you anyway. So what the heck? You know, just do a poem or to her or something, because that didn't look like her.
We have time for one last question. Yes, all the way in the back in the corner there.
First of all, thank you for your really thoughtful and insightful remarks today. I had a question really from the perspective of an artist. I think what you're bringing up about an additive solution is really interesting, where you can place things in juxtaposition or in dialogue with existing art is very interesting. But even here in New York, as far as a case study, I would bring up the Bull downtown and the Fierce Girl, where the Fierce Girl that's put in opposition to that, and what does that do, like, as far as artists, for the artist's intent, and then how do you resolve those sort of issues? It just, I think the additive approach can be a really great one in a lot of ways, but it also brings up, like, what issues for artists. And
just to clarify for everybody in the audience, I'm sure many of you know, but there's the famous bull down at Bowling Green, and then a statue of a fierce girl who was sort of posed like this arose overnight one night. It became a sort of quite viral story, and if I'm not mistaken, it was erected by a financial services company. And the bull itself was a work by an Italian artist, if I'm not mistaken.
I think, you know, it's important to, when we have these conversations, to draw the line between the artist and the cultural producer, art administrator, right? We need, as art administrators, we need to protect the artist. And Siri, you were talking about context, right? You know, Dana Schultz can paint whatever she wants in her studio. The problem is that when we bring it into the context of a museum, and you know what that context means, that's when we start having these issues. And just being conscious about the decisions that we make as curators, cultural producers, art administrators, and what does it do to the artists and protect them is extremely important.
But this question about addition, the case of Sam Durant is interesting here too, right? That it was Sam Durant himself who
Yes.
transformed the work and then allowed other people to transform it in turn. The idea that the transformation of Sam Durant's work was something that Sam Durant approved,
Yes.
unlike this case.
Right. I mean, this was the piece was going through a journey through all of this,
Right.
and and I think, Melvin, your point earlier about every work is conceptual. I mean, this concept for him needed to go through that journey in order for the work to be in any way successful. In the context where it was in Minneapolis, for him it no longer functioned. He did not want that to cause that kind of trauma and harm, and so it needed to go to the next step.
Right.
At one point, there had been threats of burning it down, and Sam said, "That's okay, if that's what happens." But the park board doesn't allow that kind of thing. So, but he wanted to see what would happen next and how that story might continue.
I'm afraid we have to leave it here just because we have so many other wonderful panelists. But these wonderful panelists, I want to say thank you to.
So good.
Thank you.
We're going to do a quick tech changeover, so give us a couple minutes, and then I'll be introducing the keynote. Thank you. We're just going to change over the participants on the stage. Hi, I'm Julia Friedman, Senior Curatorial Manager at Madison Square Park Conservancy, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote conversation with Julian Zugazagorcha and Allison Saar. Julian Zugazagorcha joined the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art as the 5th director and CEO in September of 2010. Since his arrival, attendance has grown 43%. Born in Mexico and educated at the Sorbonne and the École du Louvre in France, Zugazagorcha has worked at institutions in the Americas, Europe, and Africa. He served as director and CEO of El Museo del Barrio in New York and worked at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York and as a consultant and curator with UNESCO and the Getty Conservation Institute. Zugazagorcha curated exhibitions for the International Art Fair, ARCO 2005, the 25th Sao Paulo Biennial in 2002, and as Director of Visual Arts with the Spoleto Festival. Allison Saar. Allison Sarr's Feline and Fallow was on view in 2011 in Madison Square Park. She was commissioned by New York City's Percent for Art to realize the Harriet Tubman Memorial titled Swing Low in Harlem. Sarr has had solo exhibitions at public institutions, including the National Museum of Women in the Arts, the Brooklyn Museum, and the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden. Her work is in public collections, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the Whitney Museum. Sarr received a BA from Scripps College and an MFA from Otis College of Art and Design. Please join me in welcoming Julian and Allison.
Good morning.
Yes, like that.
You want this first?
All right.
Yeah.
Certainly. Oh, great. What a wonderful turnout, and it's so exciting to finally have these issues. Well, not finally, it's been going on, but it's great to so I'm looking forward to our conversation, and I'll just jump right in because I know, oh, on the left, right? Okay, tell me.
All right.
Up?
Let's see again.
I thought they were saying
Maybe I'll do
this.
this.
Here you go.
Okay. Oh, no. Well, then.
You got it?
Okay.
We're starting with you.
So then I
Apparently.
thought we were finishing with this, but
Okay.
but then this is a good way just to frame and go into the conversation we're really going to have. And as Brooke Rapport mentioned, Kansas City has gone through removing also a monument, and a monument that was built by the Daughters of the Confederacy in 1934. But the question really is the scars that are left behind by these monuments, and how to also sometimes remain and maintain those scars alive. Just coming back from Berlin recently for a symposium that the New York Times organized, and having been to Berlin many times before the wall came down, my surprise was to see how little of that scar is still left, and how important it is to have that. I was thinking if I were to take my kids to Berlin today and explain them how going to the other side, to the east side, at the time was difficult and complicated, it's very difficult even to recall where those were. So in a way, this Confederacy movement reminds me, or also when we're talking about Tilt Arc, how are those markers? How do you maintain a memory of that? And this is, if you see this, could be an advertising in an arts magazine. It's by Ho Contemporary Gallery, a gallery in Kansas City, advertising an exhibition of Archie Scott Gobber. And this is a piece that he did, a memorial for a Confederate movement that is no longer there. So this is the Confederate movement monument. My surprise is that what was commissioned in 1934 and installed there in Kansas City. My biggest surprise is that the order to remove it came after it was vandalized by an acting chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy that is based in St. Louis. That is also a question that we should address. So these are the New York Times article, the Kansas City Star article. This became a very conceptual piece. And let me tell you, that Confederacy bench is on my path from my home to the Nelson Atkins Museum. I go through that street twice a day. And that monument had never really caught my attention until it was boarded like this. And this was really, at the time I thought, is this for the Olympics? I really didn't know what was going on. But it does become a presence all of a sudden. So something that you see and it is transparent to you because it has always been there and I had never known what it was, became finally present under this guise. And now, this is the next day, it had disappeared. And so what was interesting, and I just want to end up, this is the piece at the gallery that is actually still going on in Kansas City. But it is a very poignant piece, and a piece that I think brings me to the importance of artists, and that's why it's an honor to be with Alison Sarr today, it is because I think art and artists have always had a way of interpreting the time that they're living and also posing the right questions or open-ended questions. So for Archie Scott Gobber, it's not a statement one way or another. It is problematizing the issue of a lost monument. And then here is a photograph of taking that particular monument that he had carved by people who carve those kind of things on a regular basis, and he installed it at the location to take this photograph. And the photograph is actually by another artist. And this is now the installation of the two in relationship. Now, the question is, that signifier by itself on the location has a more meaning, and the picture documenting that performance, they had to do it very early in the morning, took a picture. They were feeling that there was some tension in doing that. And today, that relationship is the interesting one. And now the question that we have is like, with the picture, does it have more meaning? Could this be a multiple that goes to many places where some Confederacy moment? What does it mean? And I think it is an open-ended question for most of this, but I would like just to end up with a quote, and I think echoing what has been said, that history is complicated. Walter Benjamin, on his thesis on philosophy of history, written just before the Second World War, says there is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. So I think with that, we pass it on now to the discussion of why artists and how artists reflect on that. And I think we have to trust on the artist to show us the way.
All
and
right.
now we have these great images by you.
Okay.
And I should have brought also just an advertising here, like a plug. We have a marvelous piece by you called Subway Preacher.
Subway Preacher, right.
From 1984 that sometimes we do things good and early. We bought it in 1993, so still, it was that early acquisition for
Yeah,
Nelson.
it was early on.
Visionary for our people.
Great. All right. So, sometimes, wait, so which button are you pushing?
I push this
That's
one.
right.
But, with the magic
We'll see
thing.
if it
you have
works.
to do like this.
A lot of flourish. So sometimes I half jokingly say that, the problem with public art is the public. And, it's a real challenge because it isn't a singular thing, and because, we don't want to be putting stuff out there that is somehow, tone deaf or blind to things that are going on and things that may be going on in the future and issues of the past. So, I have a little story about Swing Low, or the monument to Harriet Tubman up on 125th Street, part of a series of sculptures that look at abolitionists. And so I created this piece, and I should say I was a little taken aback that when it was first unveiled, and I think I had gone back to the site to take some photos of it, and then was walking back through the neighborhood, and some guys on the stoop kind of like stopped me, and they said, "Are you the artist that made that thing?" And I'm like, "Yeah." Again, like similar to the Wells conversation. And they said, "Well, you were completely ignorant. You didn't know what you were doing. Harriet Tubman, the Underground Railroad went north, and where's her rifle?" And they were just so angry. And in fact, for about a year, there was a series of blogs going on about how, I'm sorry if I have my back to you, basically I didn't know what I was doing, and it was an abomination to the story of Harriet Tubman. And there was, I think, 1,000 signature petition going around to have her turned facing north, which I don't know if you're familiar with that property, but directly north is the jail. And I was like, that's the last thing I'm going to do. She avoided capture all these years. Last thing I'm going to do is send Harriet Tubman to jail. And so, what was really wonderful was that, as these people were kind of putting out these kind of like, not hate blogs, but, concern blogs, there was also all of these other blogs that are coming up in conversations, and they had town meetings about it and all these things. And so I think, maybe that's the power of these pieces. And people are always saying, well, does art have the, does it have any role in our political climate, and what role is that? And I think, by these dialogues are a really important part of the pieces, and, maybe not necessarily part of the intent of the piece, but I think it's actually a really wonderful byproduct of having these pieces out there. the other issue. So, so then I said, well, I was explaining to them, I said, well, it's not a monument to the Underground Railroad, it's a monument to Harriet Tubman. And the reason why we, value her contribution is because she went south again and again and again. And it was really that courage and that compassion. And I really kind of wanted to see this monument as a monument to compassion. And so that was, and then the other thing was Harriet's gun. And there's a small etching of her holding a rifle. And I think it was interesting, someone had a question about mythology and how many of these monumental memorial figures are really, have a heavy duty mythology. And I think that's, one of the roles of artists is to really kind of like do as thorough research as you possibly can and try to sift out, the untruths. And again, those truths and untruths will continue to change as time goes by, but try to kind of be really singular and truthful in putting that work out there, and try to avoid some of the stuff. So again,
but for you there, truth was trying to be accurate insofar as a representation of that rifle, or truth was a deeper truth that would be, as you just said, to make a monument to compassion. And how do you navigate those two in an iconographical way?
That's where the artist part comes in, right? So, I didn't want to say, because she did have a rifle when she was in the Union Army, but it was not part of her, part of her process for as an Underground Railroad conductor. And so, I wasn't really interested in necessarily talking about her as, a member of the Union Army, but as this other part. But I also didn't want people to have this illusion that Harriet Tubman was shooting her way out of the South, I mean, and what we really value about her and what she was really amazing was that she was stealthy and she was highly intelligent and just clever as get all. So, it was really a monument on top of being compassionate. And to have this sort of Western kind of like cowboy idea that, with rifle, you're going to like free the world, which I'm really kind of, I feel very differently. So that's kind of where I insert myself and my thoughts and my ideas. And as it turns out, it's problematic. And as it turns out, I think it created a really interesting dialogue. Yeah. And so let's see what else. And so, and I think what's interesting is also this notion that once these monuments are up there, that they're going to just kind of continue to have this be viewed through the artist's singular intent. And I know that she has had different plantings. I think at one point someone planted cotton in her field, which I thought was really interesting. And of course, maybe was it a year and a half ago, someone put a pussy hat on her, a pink pussy hat on her. Which again also created all these dialogues and these I don't want these white feminists like putting pink pussy hats on, blah, blah, blah. And then, people forget that, Harriet Tubman was also a feminist too. And so, I just love that she's kind of being embraced and that she becomes reflective of the people that are seeing her. And I think now, people are, labor marches start there and they become a source of all these things that kind of go out and go beyond, what I ever envisioned the work to be. And then I think.
So tell us before we move about the faces that are part of her skirt and some of those details.
Right. So first, so the faces are basically what I thought were her, her quote unquote passengers, and then there's objects of the few things that she would be able to carry with her and handle, and then she has a pouch which has her pistol in it. If you look really closely, actually, that's true. And she's kind of pulling these roots behind her, and so the roots are kind of supposed to symbolize not only her having to uproot herself, and basically she stole away without telling her family, her husband, or anyone, and then also her role of uprooting slavery in general. And then I was kind of punning off of her. The railroad aspect of the Underground Railroad and her petticoat, kind of ultimately a feminist sort of portion of a garment is a cattle catcher, basically shoving all, she's parting traffic. If you're coming uptown, she basically parts traffic around her. And the little stories, the little quilt things around her are based on Harriet Powers, a really amazing African-American quilt maker whose works are in the Smithsonian collection. So I was kind of basing the pictograms of stations of Harriet Tubman's life in there. And so because she was illiterate, I thought it would really be interesting to tell her story through images as opposed to words. Yeah. So, and then, see, you're going to have to push it because I, oh, okay.
There you go.
Oh,
that is the roots.
there's the roots.
Exactly.
Yeah, and we can go on. And I think that's. Oh, so it's not just me.
There you go. Hold on. Now
Oh,
you
not-
want to- yes.
So then, the other piece I kind of wanted to bring up was York, which is called Terra Incognita. It's a piece that was commissioned by Lewis and Clark College in Oregon, Portland, Oregon. And when they put the call out, I saw it, and immediately I had an idea for this piece. But I'm like, no way is, and Portland, Portland, there's these aspects of Portland which are very, hipster and all this other stuff. There's a history of Portland being a big stronghold for white supremacy and just surrounding Oregon and Bend and all of that. We all know what's going on around there as well. So, I'm like, there's no way the school is going to go for this idea. And so I didn't submit anything. And the committee called me and said, we really want you to submit something. Would you please consider? And I said, well, I have an idea, but there's no way you're going to go for it. And she said, well, just try me. And I said, well, I want to show York, from the front, he kind of looks like this sort of classic, monument with his rifle. And I should say, for those of you who don't know, York was the sole black member of the Lewis and Clark expedition and was a slave of Clark. Actually, was a childhood slave of Clark. I think they grew up together, basically. And so he was brought mainly to help take care of Clark, because Clark couldn't function without him. And he was the only one after, there was rumors that he was going to be granted his slavery, and everyone in the expedition was given money, even Sacagawea was. He was not given any money, and he was not granted his freedom. And so now they're kind of like, well, yeah, we're going to make a monument to him and all of that. But it was kind of like, yeah, but we're not telling the story about the villains that Lewis and Clark were. And so I said, this is my idea. We're going to have this sculpture from the front. He's very, he's got his rifle, which was, again, these guns are so important to this mythology, which of course was promptly taken away from him after the expedition. But he's there with his rifle, and he's looking over the vista of, the frontier yet to be claimed. And but then on the backside, I wanted to cut scarification into his back of one of the pages of the maps from the Lewis and Clark expedition. And so I was not only talking about Lewis and Clark as being slaveholders, but also to talk about the entire expedition as claiming and colonizing America, and that indigenous people that were living on these lands were soon to be killed or moved out. And so it really kind of became this grander story. And instead of trying to put a plaque, kind of trying to say that, I basically took, I think we have maybe 8 excerpts from the journal. That some of them talk about how York saved their butt, he killed some bison and they all ate that day, or he actually literally helped one of them out of a ravine. But on the other one would be like, oh, he was acting, hinty, and we had to give him thrashings and all of these things. And so, kind of simultaneously showing, and that, he couldn't possibly be freed because I really need him, for the rest of my life. So that's what that piece ended up being.
History is complex. Exactly.
History is complex. And again, making these things, when I was working on Tubman, my father, I was actually sitting by his bedside. He was on his deathbed. And he was like, this piece is going to exist, for a long time after you're gone. This is looking at, possibly 2 centuries. How do you feel about that? And I had never really thought about that. And I think, in some ways, I have sort of guilt that we're, littering the world with all of these objects in one sense. But I never really felt that it needed to be something, permanent forever, permanent for all eternity. And, unless we stem our current tide, a political tide, we may at some point, be looking at the removal of Harriet Tubman. She was a criminal. She, did this, she did that. And so, I think it's problematic that if we think beyond our own sort of time and present, how are these works that are being created now going to be viewed, should be kind of.
50, 100 years from now, yeah.
Or one,
that is,
or 50.
well, in today, 15 minutes, yeah, the increments of a day of news brings to us the feeling of walking through sandstones. Yeah, air is not the same. Nevertheless, the conversations that we're having are perhaps a positive result of that. And as much as I feel our humanities are being attacked every day, the sense of also even the science, one would not think that people would even question gravity or things like that. But apparently they're questioning even the most scientific evidences. But even the scientific principles, I think what is being in question and sometimes is almost all of that comes from the encyclopedia. That notion, an ideal that progress can be achieved, that the human spirit can continue to learn, and that is sometimes what I feel is holding us back. And so on the contrary, producing visual and tangible elements that would stand at least a few years gives us perhaps the points that will make us jump the present, the immediate present that feels like such contentious.
Yeah. Well, I think, and that's, I think, part of the issue of, the choice for erasure. Right? And that, with erasure, I don't know about you all, but I like to keep an eye on my enemies. And if they're completely eradicated, if that history is no longer visible, then then we stand the danger of experiencing things that we're experiencing now.
Totally.
And that, as long as it's, suppressed and secretive, as long as it's these secret societies or whatnot, that they kind of can build up steam. And I think, we constantly need to keep an eye on these things.
So in discussing some of these issues with an arts educator and also consultant in museums, Elaine, whose last name I'm totally botching, but who has been instrumental in doing and consulting for a lot of heritage museums and museums also who have to deal... Gurian, exactly. Elaine Gurian. Her take is, how do you invite, and if you're South Africa or if you've gone through Rwanda genocides, how do you invite creating a museum, how do you invite then the voice of that who was the murderer? Because even if you're writing history, and even if now you're on the right side of history, how do you give a voice then that enemy, or to that one who wanted to abolish you? And so that voice is also taken into consideration as you move forward in history. And I think those are the most interesting debates of heritage museums in that sense. And on the other side, it is how to move forward. And looking at, and it's not about erasure, because from the moment you erase, and this is the question about these Confederate monuments that are springing 1934 still, or that there's still, it's like, what part of a dialogue has never been breached between two sides, so that we as a society all move forward and leave that behind and reconcile. So those, I think, are again questions that will remain and need to continue being
Well, I think
developed.
that's part of, I'd recently done an exhibition that was called Still, and it was trying to, and it was right after Obama was elected, and we were getting cartoons of watermelons on the White House lawn and all these things, and it was kind of like, what does it take to really understand what is going on in these people's minds? And to kind of really, so you really have to understand that history, and you have to understand their manifestos, or know their manifestos. I don't know if there's any chance of actually understanding them, but know them and know kind of, what thinking brings them to this place in order to be able to somehow, I don't know if we can change their thinking, but somehow, and maybe it's just to know what we're up against and know where to put up our, how to put on our armor against it. But still, I think, again, trying to pretend that it never existed is extremely problematic.
It's more dangerous, I think. Those are, so I think we might have time for some questions from the audience. And, all right, one completely over there, there's a mic coming to you.
So I have sort of a general question as an artist who does public work. Have you ever been in a situation where the funding for that work was coming from institution or business or a partnership of a private, real estate, excuse me, company, for example, and the city that was sort of contrary to the message of that work?
I'm glad you brought that up because that is part of the massive part of this. And I think something that was really showed my lack in diligence in researching the space. The bittersweet component of this Tubman Memorial is that it's a percent for the arts funding that comes from basically the dismantling of Harlem. That, apartments, maybe a few backdoor, poor door apartments, but middle to upper income apartments that were being built and taken away, affordable housing was basically what funded this. And in some way, and I think that's what some of the remarks were coming from in these blogs was that, Harriet Tubman was being ushered out of Harlem. I mean, she wouldn't be going south. Lord knows where she's going these days, where there's like nowhere else to go. But, and I don't know if that would have necessarily changed the work, but I think I would have been interested in having a dialogue prior to that. And I know in Los Angeles, Leimert Park is now going through a lot of changes. It's a traditionally African American community, really the heart of African American arts in the 50s and 60s to the present. And they're seeing, of course, artists always come and screw up the neighborhood because once artists are there, then everybody wants to live there, right? And, we are always the entree to gentrification. And so they're now, and someone said, yeah, we're looking to get some public art. And he says, if for nothing else, so that people will remember that we were once here. And it was just like, oh my God, that's so intense. But, cities are amoebas. They're constantly changing and renovating themselves. And so, if nothing else, perhaps Tubman will, signify that Harlem was once an African-American community.
Totally. So. Fabulous. I think we have time for one last question all the way up. That side.
I happened upon your Harriet Tubman sculpture one day. I'm never in that neighborhood, and it was such a wonderful surprise to see that on that corner and that crossroads. But everything you described about it, I actually was thinking why she was facing the way she was facing. But, and when you go to a museum, you can read about what the artist is talking about. But when you're in a public space, that description isn't there. So do you ever think about the public when you're creating your sculptures? Think about how they might come upon it and perceive it?
I don't know, and I think that's an interesting question for museums as well in terms of how much sort of didactic sort of information do you want to put out there. I mean, I think what's wonderful about art is to allow it to speak itself, and that people will always bring different things to it, right? I mean, people from different experiences are going to bring very different things to Harriet Tubman, regardless of what's on a panel.
We're always that is the tension also of any institution, is how much information complements the work of art, how much takes away from the experience of the work of art itself. We're all trusting also that technology will allow us that the labels that we put are no longer the battlefields of our curatorial and education departments, because on the one side, curators want to do their PhD in a label, and God knows that 300 pages cannot be summed. And then our educators are trying to, on the words of the curators, water it down. And it's like, well, the important thing is, how do you catch the people's attention to build curiosity? In my words, what I would want and aspire is that a work of art is powerful enough to speak by itself, but also to instill in its viewers the curiosity to learn a bit more. And depending where you're coming from, what angle you're coming from, what experiences you're coming from, you want to research something that is meaningful to you.
Right.
And technology will allow us that. I don't know if tomorrow, but in the next weeks, I'm sure.
But I think, again, like you said, that curiosity, you come to a work of art and you're looking at this and you're not quite getting, why does she got roots coming out of her dress and all that thing? It really, you can't really, you can talk till you're blue in the face to try to instruct someone how to think and how to feel. But if they're there and experiencing it firsthand, and maybe trying to struggle with what these kind of incongruous components to the sculpture is, and I think they own that and understand it in a way that totally is their own. And I don't know.
And I think and I maybe to end on that, that's what we really love, is that art is it's more open. Otherwise, an essay would be a bad venue, no, or a biography.
Right.
But the fact that the art allows first the creativity and unique vision of an artist meet the unique circumstance of its viewer. And it's in that bridge that the magic of art happens, I feel.
Absolutely.
All right. Well,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. What an honor to be with you. Do we keep the mics or do we keep them? Oh, we come back. Okay, okay.
To keep the mics, yeah. I'd like to introduce our next speakers, artists Diana Al-Hadid and Arlene Sheckett, and architect Brian C. Lee Jr. Diana Al-Hadid's Delirious Matter is on view in Madison Square Park through September 3rd, 2018. Al-Hadid has had solo exhibitions at distinguished public institutions, including the Hammer Museum, Nasher Sculpture Center, and Secession Vienna. Her work is in public collections including De Cordova Museum and Sculpture Park, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, and the Whitney Museum. Al-Hadid received a BFA in sculpture and a BA in art history from Kent State University, an MFA in sculpture from Virginia Commonwealth University, and continued her studies at Skowhegan. Arlene Sheckett's Round and Round will open in Madison Square Park in fall of 2018. Her critically acclaimed 20-year survey titled All at Once was on view at the ICA Boston in 2015. She has had numerous solo exhibitions at public institutions, including the Frick Collection, the Phillips Collection, and the Rhode Island School of Design Museum. Her work is in distinguished public collections, including the National Gallery of Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Whitney Museum. Sheckett received a BA from New York University and an MFA from Rhode Island School of Design. Brian C. Lee Jr. is the founder and director of Collocate Design, a nonprofit multidisciplinary design practice in New Orleans dedicated to expanding community access to design and creating spaces of racial, social, and cultural equity. Lee most recently worked as the Place and Civic Design Director for the Arts Council of New Orleans, and prior to that at Eskew, Dumas, and Ripple, an architecture firm in New Orleans. Lee is the founding organizer of the Design Justice Platform and organized the Design as Protest National Day of Action. He received a Bachelor of Science in Architecture from The Ohio State University and an MA in Architecture from the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Diana Al-Hadid, to the stage.
I'll get right to it. I've been experiencing some deja vu since I've opened the show at the park. So I'm going to share with you some kind of embarrassing undergraduate work to start. Just because I've realized I feel like I've been kind of making the same work for a long time in various ways. So from the get-go, I've never wanted to make objects. I've only wanted to construct spaces. I've wondered, how can you carve into a space? How can you create more space by bringing things into it? I was obsessed with membranes and parameters and boundaries and lines and planes. So the word monument can either mean a carved statue, or it can mean a boundary or position marker. So for me, if you take this definition, you have to think about scale, and you have to think about history, and you have to think about typologies, of course. So when I was at Kent State, I made, I was born in Syria, but I was raised in the suburbs of Ohio. So I was working with landscape as far back as undergrad, but in synthetic form. So these are like astroturf or vinyl little pods. They were kind of cozy, womb-like interiors. I made caves out of paper plates or monumental dresses out of paper plates that you could enter from underneath. This is a modest mountain, which is an unzipping mountain that reveals a cast plaster of Victoria's Secret underwear. So there was an element of kitsch and irony, and I was ripe from my teenage years. So, and there's also a little element of the feminine in landscapes. So these things, either they held a body or they were a body, or as in the case of this piece, they were made by my body. So for this, I put paint on the soles of my feet, and I danced the waltz, and to establish the location of the spires. This is past undergrad. And I basically used my footprints as the blueprints of the building. So I love this role play of typologies when a landscape becomes a figure, which becomes then a building. I'm really interested in material role play as well. So sometimes the material is so transformed that it might look like a little bit of a hallucination. But in fact, I arrive at these hallucinatory states by a study of the materials themselves and figuring out what they can really do. So sometimes something can feel discrete and concrete, but then simultaneously liquid and unstable. So this piece is called Immortal Repose. It's actually my first truly figural work. So here's a figure kind of relaxing into her pose, maybe a little too much. She's self-aware that she's playing with her melt. The plinth is more fit for a standing monument, but here her feet give way. So she's really more like landscape mode than portrait mode. So it took me a long time to get my head around figurative work. So leading up to this piece, there was always work that implied the figure. So there would be like an open seat or stairs that were just a little out of reach, or a path to walk, an imagined path like a labyrinth. So it was always largely landscape or architectural, so monumental on the one hand, but always originating from very small details. I was comfortable working with either really small or really large, and it was that in-between human scale that I was getting stuck. My theory is that it's because I took up that space. My own body took up that space. But when I finally did start working with the figure, it was never as a whole. It was just heads, or feet, or limbs. Parts recycled or restaged into a new context. There's always a fragment or a remnant. So for a while, I made work with only one figure, and then I decided I wanted to make something with two figures. So this is a cenotaph for two. So a cenotaph is a monument where the body or the bodies are remembered are not actually on the site. So it's like an empty tomb. It's usually just for one person or a group of people to commemorate an event. But so this piece, as you kind of walk around it, you see that from the back there's something missing. And then I wanted to make a work with a bunch of figures to kind of imagine what would be the minimum number that might make up a group or civilization. This work is called Noli's Orders, and it's actually going to be on view at the Bronx Museum next month. It's titled Noli's Orders, and it refers to the Noli map from the mid-1700s, which was a study of the relationship between private and public spaces. So in a way, I feel like I always kind of need a map, or I always need something to extrude from the ground up. So here I sort of imagined extruding a painting. So you have the pictorial element from the front, and as you move around, you see the rest of what the material of the painting, which would be these very simple lines and planes and verticals and horizontals and drips and pools, and they all kind of join together to create something more massive. These are all just like little drips of sort of like a plaster suspended midair. So I'm obsessed with extremes in scale. You sense your body more acutely, and you notice your own boundaries. So, and it can also create a sense of the uncanny. So this is another throwback to a very sort of embarrassing work, but I kind of, this is one of those things I was like, oh, this is interesting. I was kind of doing something similar. Of course, this is my only totally horizontal work, but this is in a sculpture park, or it's probably gone by now, but in a sculpture park in Maryland. And I was just out of grad school. It was about 13 years ago. And you walk down this path into the woods, and the path narrows, and then you notice that you've been walking along the board game of life, like the Hasbro Brothers board game Life. So there's a cast concrete little life. So my next public sculpture, the next time I was allowed to make a public sculpture, was for the Sharjah Biennial, and now it's totally vertical. And this piece too reminded me of the work I have in the park. So it's kind of like, looks to me like a spiraling building coming out of a like erupting volcano. And so for the park show, again, I use this kind of mountainous eruption. This piece is called Citadel, which is obviously refers to architecture in the title, it's a fortress surrounded by like a moat. But it's actually a drawn female bust perched atop a mountain. And it comes from a peculiar image called Allegory of Chastity by Hans Memling, which of course, like the extreme of scale is really interesting. And it read to me, it's this insanely strange title, Allegory of Chastity. So, the whole mountain that encases her is sort of like a skirt. But I imagined her sort of as like plugging a volcano. That was kind of my hope for for the read of the work. But this did remind me again of my immodest mountain. So here the mountain is splitting open, and it's totally unchaste and reveals this golden underwear. So for the work in the oval lawn, I'm again playing with landscape. These hedges create a room around two fictional female figures painted into the panels. The outside of the room is more robust and heavy and structural, and it speaks more to the surrounding architecture in Manhattan. And then from the inside, the walls look much thinner, and the weight of the back disappears a little bit. So on one panel, this piece I called the Grotto. It's hard to see, but if you go downstairs, you can, or you go to the park, you can see it. There's a figure from the Memling painting at the pinnacle there, and the opening is where the mountain disappears and sort of makes way for passage into the room. So she's also now unchaste, and like her chastity belt sort of missing. On the opposite side, almost a mirror to the negative shape of the grotto is Godiva, and she's like a larger-than-life figure here. She's a monument and a figment of our imagination. This is the source for that work. Again, a little hard to see it in the slides, but the figure comes from So on the one hand, there's this kind of standing or sitting immobile female form, and on the other hand, there's this moving, transient woman. And she comes from a story from the early 20th century of an archaeologist who becomes obsessed with a relief sculpture. And it's a woman walking through the walls. So he's this sort of stuffy academic and sort of out of touch with his desires, and he hallucinates seeing this woman, particularly her feet. He tracks her through the crowds and chases this apparition all the way to Pompeii. And here she sort of blends into the volcanic landscape and then disappears into the ruins, and then reveals herself to be his in-the-flesh childhood crush, Zoe. So it was Freud who made this story very famous because it was he made a relationship between the process of psychoanalysis and the process of this archaeological excavation. So it's like, in some ways, my very early work here, again, I've made an enclosed space, an intimate space, but this time in the center of Manhattan. So we come full circle. Thank you.
Hi. Here I am. Okay. After sitting through the first part of this conference, I want to talk about all of the issues that have been brought up, and how eloquent everybody has been, and how many interesting things can be spoken about in relationship to public art. It does remind me once again how I always think that making art is sort of nuts, and making and extremely difficult, and that making public art and sculpture is really nuts, and that it challenges every expectation that we possibly could have, and creates new kinds of meanings, and the possibility for shared joy. And I feel like that, even though we will share problems in having works in the public arena, we have the possibility of forming community. And I'm only going to talk a little bit about my upcoming sculpture project in the park, but I am building it around the idea of creating community, and wanting to have this experience in what I now feel is very difficult times of shared joy. So anyway, onward. The core principle in Buddhist philosophy is that things change. It's also the core with which I work in my studio. Why not build change into the concept of the work, as the Tibetan Buddhist monks here have done, where they spend weeks, maybe months, making these amazing diagrams, and then have the pinnacle of that experience is to sweep it away. And that's a blessing, not a problem. So my longtime studio practice involves a kind of call and response improvisational way of working in the studio, in trying to be completely present with the work, and to celebrate the idea that sculpture, unlike painting, creates a kind of choreography and an opportunity, while being very still, to make movement. So it makes movement by creating the desire of the viewer to walk around it, to see it from all different sides. And it also creates movement by being different and presenting surprises in every view. So the last time, I'll just do a little bit of backtracking. The last time I worked with statuary was 2016, 2017 at the Frick Collection, where I was invited to curate and install their Meissen collection, along with my own porcelain works, which I had made at the Meissen Porcelain Factory during the years 2012, 2013. So this project involved, given that I was the first contemporary artist to ever do any significant thing at the Frick, created a lot of constraints, a lot of fear, and a lot of freedom at the same time, because given that they hadn't ever dealt with contemporary artists, they didn't know how deep I would get in there. So I think they thought I was going to pick some objects from the collection, not I think, I know, from the collection and put them in their porcelain cases. But I went into the gallery and I saw the Diana. And at the time that I saw the Diana, there was nothing surrounding the Diana, and you couldn't actually see anything on either side. You could just see the sides of the cases. And this beautiful gallery is facing the garden. So my first the first thing that I do in doing and embarking on any project is just to examine the absolute DNA of the situation. Some of the most obvious and basic, and I think other people have brought this up today, some of the most basic pieces of information are the ones that get overlooked, institutionally especially. And so somehow the Frick had forgotten that this beautiful place was facing the garden. And the way they were displaying things was putting big, heavy plinths in front of the windows. So we removed those, we removed some heavy drapery, and we gave Diana, who was lonely, some company. And I curated the whole exhibition because I had to have a conceit based on the garden image. So I tried to just constantly reinforce this very special relationship that the Frick, this place, has with the garden. And of course, subliminally in there is the fact that 18th century porcelain artists were obsessed with nature and bringing delight to the people who were collecting their work. So so here is the view from the portico, and also you can see there's a circular gallery in which Diana lived, but she was very alone in that circular gallery. She was placed there and probably shouldn't be there, but was placed there by a curator who loved her. But it turns out everybody and all the conservators are hysterical about the fact that she's by Antoine Houdon. It's a very, wonderful sculpture, but they're worried about her painted surface. So they're constantly trying to close the window shades and like that. But anyway, I tried to put her back in the garden, and I put her back in the garden by taking a wall of that circular gallery and making this gilded mirror. And the gilded mirror is seamless with the limestone block wall. And by having this gilded mirror behind her, it reflects the garden in a pretty nice way. There you can see the limestone. This, from my point of view as a contemporary artist, was a work of art. From the point of view of the Frick collection, it was exhibition design. So that right there's interesting issues. And we're talking interesting issues 2 years ago with a very knowledgeable group of curators and sophisticated languages. But, that's fine. It was so, my whole intervention was meant to be relatively understated and subtle. I did not want to announce, especially because this was their first project. I didn't want to announce that I was this 21st century artist stepping heavily into the frick. My hope is that they, I think it turned out well, but my hope was that they could continue to invite artists to partake. Anyway, I made these bouquets or clouds of painted garden plates to surround Diana, so that when one is at the entrance to the gallery, you can see Diana rotating among those plates. I made, instead of having heavy plinths to display work, I made these translucent tables to display the work, so that everything was very permeable, and that there was a language that leapt from the inside to the outside constantly. Now, on the outside, you might see these porcelain animals. That was another one of the interventions. It turns out in the 18th century, Meissen, to show off how well they could make things, made large porcelain animals. And when I was at the Meissen factory, on the right here is a picture that I took in the springtime at the Meissen porcelain factory. They put the porcelain animals outside. And I petitioned with the Frick, and over a long period of time, we were able to put their porcelain animals outside. So back to the Meissen, I am now taking the porcelain plate on the left, which I made at Meissen, and I, in conjunction with the Kohler plumbing factory, am constructing for the park these very large porcelain pieces that people will be able to play with, hopefully. So what I'm doing is I'm taking here's a couple of here's a view of my studio. So here you see this little pool, and here I'm currently under construction. And so I have a few different ideas that I'm working with, and one is I'm emptying the pool and gonna make that a place to play and converse as a circle. I'm also creating a family of sculptures to animate the outer rim of the pool area, and only dealing with the hardscape, because it is my belief that the hardscape is the most representational part of the park, certainly of New York City. And I wanted to take on, I live in the country part of the time, and I feel like the hardscape is more exotic in a certain way. It's certainly not a garden. So this is a rough scheme of what I'm about, so that people can not identify a single thing, but have a relationship to a family of sculptures. And here's the guy who anchors it. I think Brooke showed him before. Admiral Farragut standing atop the two women carved by St. Gaudens, courage and loyalty. But anyway, there he is. he's most well known for saying, "Damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead," and there he is with his coat open. So I doubt that phrase, that posture would really be where he's standing above these two women would really work right in this culture that we have, or it has interesting double entendre that I welcome and will respond to with my own figure that will be carved at the base. And I'm just going to show two projects that I realize led up to this, and one is a project I did in 2003 at Snug Harbor Cultural Center, where, again, I'm choosing it because it's this naval site, and I chose the room that had a wheel in the ceiling. It's basically where people went to die, where sailors went to die, and I reflected that, and I hope you can see it on the left, in a floor text that's an enlarged version of the wheel. Exactly. And that over the 6 months that was there, the idea was that people would walk over that text and it would disappear. So sort of circling back into that idea of things should disappear, things should change. And then the last thing I'll show you is a project I did in 2001 at St. John the Divine, where I mapped out the architecture of the baptistry, and the architecture of the baptistry is precisely the same as the architecture of a Buddhist stupa or a mandala. And I put the floor plan of a very famous stupa all around to make it a circumambulation, which is what I'm doing at the park here, and I had totally forgotten about until a few weeks ago. But anyway, so it is a circumambulation and has places where in a Buddhist stupa, in a mandala, there are 4 Buddhas on east, west, north, south, and I put a beautiful Buddhist poem all around. So anyway, provoking the idea that in order to read the whole thing, you had to walk around, and these red tape marks, simple tape marks where the Buddhas would be, and to my surprise, and this was one of my first outings into making public work, at the opening and thereafter, people would sit as Buddhas in those places. So in a way, it was so obvious, and I completely didn't understand that or expect that. So, I think for artists, having the opportunity to work in the public, to work at all is a privilege. To work in the public and have an enlarged audience is completely a privilege, and a huge way that we can learn about our own work and our place in the world, and perhaps make a small contribution. Thank you.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? All right, so I started this from a couple different angles. I am an architect by trade, an artist for life. That has been the direction of my entire career path, has been the juxtaposition or the connection between those two things in earnest. And so what I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about is how we, as an organization, started to develop this thing called design justice, and how that led into a current project called Paper Monuments. We'll be very specific about the Paper Monuments part, and a little bit more specific about the kind of ideology behind it. So again, our practice, co-locate design, is a design practice that focuses on trying to dismantle the privilege and power structures that use architecture and design and the physical world as a means to perpetuate injustice into the world. And so how do we understand what those things look like, the power structures, the injustices themselves, and how do we dismantle those from the start? I used to always say, I used to have this quote called basically that architecture is the hardware to the software of life. And art is the user interface, right? It's the way in which we understand the complexities of the physical world and the social realm to which we live in. And so if we are able to see art as a distillation or not a summary, but a pureness of those other experiences, moments, it allows us to kind of understand it in a completely different way. And so I often urge people to kind of consider what that physical world does to us. It's constant, it's persistent, whether that's in the good or in the negative. These spaces that we build the things that we build are important, and they weigh heavy on us throughout time and space. I often point to this just simply because, again, an artist had to go pull a neon sign and make that neon sign and went to his weekly efforts to do that, and it took him probably 10 days to make the whole thing, and he put it up and he was very proud, and it still applied to the dehumanization and the oppression of people. And these are people attempting to maintain their humanity in the face of that oppression, right? So what does it look like for us to at least consider that at the top of our decision-making processes, specifically when it comes to public intervention or public spaces? And again, for every injustice, there is a architecture that has been designed to perpetuate it. And so we base a lot of that work around these kind of 4 or 5 core questions. Again, what are the power structures that exist within the world we live in? What are the injustices that result from those power structures? Who does it directly and disproportionately impact? How does it manifest or facilitate or perpetuate that injustice? And then what are our opportunities to reconcile, to have a conversation with, to imagine a new system that seeks to eliminate, mitigate, or address those issues by design through art? And as the Place and Civic Design Director for the Arts Council in New Orleans, we actively sought to change our conversations from one of art for art's sake. And it's not to say that art for art's sake is not a beautiful thing. It is to say that in New Orleans, where the issues are so prevalent, are so raw, what does it mean for us to actually consider public art for public good? What does it mean to understand who has the right to the public realm? Those are the conversations that we continue to have. So I'm going to actually jump to, again, how we're framing a lot of this, because culture is really how we define the majority of our work, and understanding what culture actually is, right? So culture for us is the consequence of persistent circumstance and immediate condition. And so how do we understand that, but through the moments that create that culture, the tendencies that result of that, the habits, the rituals, and ultimately the long-term cultures that result of those spaces. And so when we create things like General P.T. Beauregard in New Orleans, or Robert E. Lee in New Orleans, or Andrew Jackson in New Orleans, those are spaces that shape our timeline, shape our intervention and expectations of our public realm, without necessarily understanding the rest of the cultures that are in response to these pieces. So I want to tell 2 quick stories before I jump into the way in which this all came down in New Orleans. So about 10 years ago, I was looking at the African American Museum in DC going up. I was in grad school, and I decided, okay, well, no one ever tells the story of the designers as they think about how they're going to interact with a quintessentially black space, right? And so I asked my parents, I was like, look, for birthday, give me $300. I'm going to fly out to New Mexico. I flew to New Mexico to meet with Antoine Predock and Kurt Moody, one of my mentors. And then I drove to Moshe Softy in Boston, and I went and saw David Adjaye. And so I went to all these different places and talked to all these architects about what it meant to actually think about a quintessentially black space through their own perspective, through their own cultural norms, through their own cultural environment, and see how that actually manifested into a building. And so we could tell very early on that Phil and David Adjaye were going to succeed in that, but that got me really interested in the backstory, because obviously the backstory of the African American Museum has 110-year history that I'm not going to go into, but very much is about the continuum of markers to monuments to memorials to now a wonderful museum. So in New Orleans, there's a wonderful group of activists, Take 'em Down NOLA, who we all sat in a room in 2015 and we said, okay, well, what does it mean for us to actually confront white supremacy and its physical manifestations in our city? This was on top of activism of 30 years before from Malcolm Suber and others across the city, and 30 years before that, who have always been trying to acknowledge and remove symbols to white supremacy throughout the city. Now, this is the White League Monument down here, which is actually a monument to essentially a version of the KKK that actually tried to overthrow the New Orleans government. So for some reason, that was up in our city for 100 years. Yeah, ridiculous, right? Robert E. Lee actually never stepped foot in our city. And not to say that he should be up anyway, but the idea that Robert E. Lee was the highest point in our city for a very long time was immensely disturbing. And so we went about creating a light projection. So at the time, my office at the Arts Council, we have a program called Lunafet, which was basically a light projection throughout the city program. And so we took that idea and projected the kind of brutal history of Robert E. Lee onto the columns, interjected with visuals of lynched people and enslaved people and the like. So as that happened, you started to see the wrong side of history. Now, all those people you saw in Charlottesville the following month were in our face a month before with AK-47s standing right in front of us and people staring them down. The right side of history eventually got more joyful. It took us so much time and effort and so many people who were in these streets trying to advocate for this. So it took us a while to kind of to get there. Now, the question became, what happens next? And what are the things that, again, lift stories that have been disinherited from the public realm over that time? And so we created a project called Paper Monuments, which is one step in a longer conversation around the continuum of what it means to advocate for the rights of all people in the public realm. And really what it is what are the moments that exist within public space that are ephemeral by nature? What are the monuments, the markers, monuments, memorials, and museums? And all of them have slightly different typological interventions in space. And so we wanted to start with the first one, which was really about connecting our artists and our community to the stories that have historically been disconnected over that time, that were rooted in New Orleans and of New Orleans. And so what did it mean for us to actually scale these at a level that allowed us to take up the side of a building or to have a handout to somebody at an event, but for them to really touch the content as a start. And then this will lead into a larger conversation around what those physical spaces look like, what are the monumentalizations look like of that. And so we started with paper, right? We scaled up, this is just a rendering of it, but we scaled up to citywide kind of mural pieces. We started to wrap storytelling events around those pieces. And not only tell the story of the individual monuments, the paper monuments that we have, but to wrap around the context of all of those stories. So it's not just the individual things that are there. There are 15, 20, 30, 100 other stories that wrap around that to make it a full, comprehensive picture. We then wanted to ask everybody in the city, as many people as possible, what do you feel is an appropriate monument to New Orleans today? Now, this is our dear friends out of Philadelphia Monuments Lab had this similar conversation, and ours is really around the context of how can we imagine how we remember, memorialize the city of New Orleans at length. And so we ask people these questions. We ask them to draw a thing, and we accumulate that, and we'll produce over the next 3 months the next phase of this project, which leads itself to much larger scale murals, a project of beacons that actually go all the way across the city, and then monuments, memorials that scale up from there. Now, the intention of this is to say that if we create a system of memory that extends the entire continuum, that we are thinking about the individual moments where our artists are dancing in the streets. See, we're in New Orleans. We have second lines every Sunday. That's an art form by its pure nature that you can dance. Like, if you go there and you try to learn the mambola, that the dance step that we do as we dance across the streets, like that is a beautiful, beautiful thing that happens for 4 hours for 36 Sundays out of the year. That ephemeral moment is powerful just as much as anything else. And so why are we not capturing those as much? So we capture those. We want to make sure that the markers are spread and that we identify, the stories that have been buried for so long, but that we also acknowledge the fact that monuments exist beyond simply the physical sculpture. They exist in the street signs. They exist in our school buildings. You mentioned earlier McDonough, Mr. Melvin. McDonough was one of the linchpins, or the McDonough Monument in New Orleans was one of the linchpins to the modern civil rights movement in the city, right? So McDonough schools throughout the city were supposed to be praised once a year. All the school students from McDonough schools would go and throw roses at the feet. Well, the little black students had to sit out in the hot sun and wait for all the white students to come up and throw their roses at the feet. And the teachers, the students, eventually revolted, and that became a thing that no longer exists in New Orleans very quickly. And so the lineage, the lines, the vectors of history connect in so many ways, and figuring out which way we want to move forward is super important. And so for me, I suggest that we always lean towards the stories of those that have been oppressed and dehumanized, and understand that in order for us as a society to move forward, we're going to have to acknowledge, lift, and honor the stories of those who have fought through and tried their best to maintain their humanity in the face of such violence. So I'll stop with that. Thanks.
We have time for 2 questions of our artists, Diana, Arlene, Brian. Are there questions? Yeah, that'd be great. Anyone? It's hard to see with the lights. So I'll start you with a question, all of you, as Diana and Arlene are sitting. Brian, you talked about what you're doing in New Orleans and a different kind of monument. Can you all describe what's the new monument? Where are we going in your work and in this conversation?
Yeah, the new monument. So I think I lean towards memorial in general. I think so. Monuments for me are interpersonal and have singular conversations oftentimes, where memorials oftentimes collectively talk about experiences and people in relationship to those experiences. So for me, it's the distillation of that, and it is also a way in which we hold the spaces that have already generated history. So for instance, there is a house in New Orleans on the West Bank. A famous, I don't want to say famous, a Black Panther who lives there by the name of Malik Rahim has done some tremendous, amazing things over the course of his life, and there's so much embodied history in that place. I think the new monuments start to be things that recognize that, hold that space together, and allow for that thing that has already engendered so much to be honored into the future.
I love the idea of getting in and getting down with what already exists, which I hope I'm doing at the park. So, taking this place that already exists and just making it better in a slightly tweaked way, but not announcing anything. Letting the people who are there announce what needs to happen. And I feel that that there is no answer, and that there shouldn't be an answer. That the multiplicity of forms is fantastic, and that we're looking to that, and that we probably have had enough with bronze guys on plinths. So we might not need to do that anymore. But aside from that, I feel like artists have good imaginations, and if people are vetted for proper instincts, they will make huge mistakes, and those mistakes will become part of the conversation, and they will also make huge contributions, and that will become part of the conversation. So I think it's all like I feel like we're in a really good place. In that things don't have to disappear; they can get taken down without going away. And I think Allison was saying, you can't. It feels important to have bad history be acknowledged as well as new thoughts. So.
Yeah, I'm going to challenge that just a little
Okay,
bit, though.
good.
Just one quick second, because yes, it is important, but we don't need to lionize it, right? The fact that these things are lifted way above and beyond any other story still gives that power dynamic that never allows for those disinherited stories to be equalized. So I think that's always the problem, is that we always continue. We're still looking up at a pedestal for Robert E. Lee, and it still holds the same, So it's that I would suggest.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that it comes down to the pedestal, and that could be a whole other conversation, because there is something about how high is it, how high is it, how big is it, and so it still has this male. That's sort of what I was getting at with the Farragut standing on top of the women. And having his coat open, that isn't something that I want to draw attention to that, and is a language that was taken for granted. And maybe Stanford White, being a great womanizer, maybe he intended it to be his little phallic joke, but the height of things does make a big difference. But do we keep getting the new information? Do we have to keep going higher and higher, or is there a horizontal version of this?
Diana?
I think the new monument creates space.
Okay.
I'm into it. No, I'm into it. As an architect, run with it. Yeah.
Okay. I also agree. There's so much that's potent in the pedestal. I mean, that was for me a way to kind of unhook myself from a certain kind of process of making objects. I, for a long time, started with setting up a blank pedestal and treating it like a blank page in a sketchbook. So that was how so many projects for me opened up, was just thinking about that space. But yeah, I think the new monument opens up space both for
artists with voices that haven't been heard before, and opens up space for people to be together, I guess.
And I think that's a great way to conclude. We're at 12 noon. This has been such a rich morning, and thank you to our extraordinary moderator and panelists, to our keynote conversation participants, to the artists on stage now. And thank you all for coming. And for leading the conversation that is likely to continue for a long time. Thank you.